In the last video lecture, we looked at virus structure and how unique the structure is compared to cellular life forms. In this video, we're going to talk about what's called symmetry. Symmetry to viruses is analogous to the term morphology when we talk about bacteria. So bacteria, there are three main morphologies or shapes. Viruses, there are actually three main symmetries or shapes: helical, polyhedral, and complex. One of those three is far more common than the others, and so on. And so we're going to talk about some of those trends. We're going to look at those structures. We're going to define symmetry. So three main symmetries: helical, polyhedral, and then complex. So here's an example: tobacco mosaic virus. Tobacco mosaic is sort of the lab rat of the virus world because it's been studied for a long time, one of the first viruses to be described and discovered. This is what we call a helical or rod-shaped virus. So this would be equivalent almost to a bacillus among bacteria, but certainly don't want to use that term for viruses. And you can see in the image on the left here, it looks like a straw. It's a long rod-shaped structure. So where does this idea of it being helical come from? As you can see in the drawing, a polymer of the capsomeres is strung together into a long chain, almost like a rope, and then that rope is coiled onto itself, forming a hollow tube, right? And that hollow tube has a rod shape to it, and it can be straight and sort of stiff like this guy here. If you remember, in an earlier video, I showed you Ebola virus, and it looked like a big worm because a helical capsid doesn't need to be straight and stiff like this. It can actually be flexible and take on some unusual forms, sort of like this. Either way, you've got a long helix of a polymer of capsomeres all strung together with the nucleic acid protected on the inside. TMV is just a great example of a rod-shaped virus. Now, if you remember from like 7th grade geometry, polyhedron means these multi-sided geometric shapes. The most common polyhedron that we see is the icosahedron, which has 20 triangular faces. Maybe you've seen those 20-sided dice before, right? That's an icosahedron. This is the most common capsid symmetry among viruses, at least among those that infect humans, is the polyhedron and specifically the icosahedron. So in this example, I gave you HPV, human papilloma virus. Super important virus. Papillomas refer to warts. Human papillomavirus causes genital warts, which sounds more like an annoyance, right? But it's also the #1 cause of cervical cancer in females. And we do have a vaccine against this. So essentially, we have a vaccine against a very common form of cancer. That's a pretty remarkable thing. When you look at the structure, you can see the 20-sided geometry or symmetry to it. And then in addition to that, you see these what are called tail fibers or attachment fibers. These are going to be analogous to the spikes that we saw on the surface of a membrane-bound or enveloped virus. But on a naked virus, we've got these attachment fibers that have specific interaction with receptors on the surface of a cell type that they can infect, right? And that becomes important, that specific interaction. You don't want if you're in this case, what do we have here? We've got a mast adenovirus. Mast adenovirus is one of the common cold viruses. It needs to infect upper respiratory epithelial cells, especially in the nasopharynx. If it bumps into your skin, it doesn't want to try infecting your skin cells. It doesn't know how to take over those cells. It doesn't have a genome that can commandeer those. If it bumps into your bladder or your liver, it's not going to try to infect those because it wouldn't know how to infect those. It doesn't have the capability. But these specific attachment fibers or tail fibers that are attached to this naked virus have a very specific chemical interaction with chemical receptors on the surfaces of the right cell type. In the case of mast adenovirus, that might be upper respiratory epithelial tissues, and that's going to be part of their steps towards tricking their way into your cells to cause an infection. And then finally, we have complex, and in a complex virus, what you see is a combination of a polyhedral head with a helical tail type structure, and then attached to that we have tail fibers. Right? These tail fibers, again, are going to be important in attachment. The nucleic acid is bound up in the head. We see complex viruses almost exclusively with the bacteriophage, the viruses that can infect only bacteria. We typically don't see complex viruses that can infect humans. For humans, we tend to see helical and polyhedral. For phage, we tend to see complex. So, for example, the T4 phage is in this image here, and that T4 phage can infect the enterobacteria, which is the family of bacteria related to E. coli. So we'll talk a little bit more about these phage. A lot of what we know about viruses comes from studying phage. Ethically and practically speaking, way easier to study than, say, an HIV variant or a virus, some other virus that infects people. So we've got three symmetries: helical, polyhedral, and complex. Complex viruses are typically going to be phage. Phage are typically going to be complex. And helical and polyhedral are the most common among humans. Polyhedral and specifically icosahedral being the most common among those. So let's summarize all that we've learned about viral symmetry. Three main symmetries: helical, which sometimes casually is called a rod. Don't use that term on an exam. Polyhedral, most commonly the icosahedron, and then complex. The icosahedron is most common. Complex is generally limited to phage. And that's it. So thanks for joining me on this video, and I hope that was helpful.